If you read a couple of news headlines, multiculturalism has doomed Europe. And according to politicians across the spectrum, like Italy's Giorgia Meloni or Denmark's Mette Frederiksen, mass immigration is a threat to the daily life of Europe. And it's hard to disagree. European cities are peppered with ethnic ghettos, ethnic minority-driven crime and racial riots, and increasingly common Islamist terror attacks. Meanwhile, Europe's minorities are poorly integrated into society, face growing discrimination, and are now becoming targets of violence. So yeah, the future is not looking too bright, and multiculturalism has damaged Europe's social fabric. But there are ways that Europe could get out of its multicultural mess, and several countries around the world, including Denmark, have managed to make it work. So could Europe follow their footsteps, or will our problems get worse? Well, let's get into it by starting to see how Europe got into this mess in the first place, by taking a brief look into the history of European multiculturalism. For most of its modern history, Europe was a continent of emigration. In the 1600s, skyrocketing food production from the agricultural revolution and the introduction of the potato led to a population boom. As a result, Europeans migrated across the world, settling in the Americas, Oceania, as well as parts of Africa. However, birth rates started to fall, first in France in the late 1700s, followed by the rest of Europe in the 1800s and 1900s, in part because of secularization. This prompted European countries, particularly in the West, to look for labor abroad. France, whose birth rates declined the earliest, actually started looking for foreign labor in Italy in the 19th century. The high casualties of World War I and World War II and the economic boom after the war pushed many European countries to look for workers, first in the south of Europe and then in what was historically unprecedented, outside of the continent. In many cases, this was facilitated by ties between European countries and their former colonies. While every European country is slightly different, we can broadly speak of 5 main ways of immigration from outside of Europe by looking at German data. The first wave of guest workers went to countries like France, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, or Belgium. Most of that immigration was low-skilled and went to work in factories, mines, and fields. However, when the post-World War II economic boom ended in the 1970s, that immigration wave slowed down. This, however, was followed by a simultaneous second and third wave of immigration through family reunification policies passed in the 1980s and refugees from the Iraq-Iran War, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet bloc, many of which went to Germany, Austria, and the Nordic countries. This was followed by yet another wave of immigration, mostly made up of asylum seekers, that continues until this day. Starting in 2011 with the Syrian civil war and the fall of Libya, many migrants headed to Germany and Sweden, as well as migrants from Africa headed to France and the UK. And finally today, we're seeing a fifth wave of immigration to Europe, again in the form of workers, as aging European countries look to deal with the effects of their shrinking working population. This latest wave has also included countries like Poland, which previously had very little immigration. This has created a tiered Europe, with countries like France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, or the UK having received immigrants from outside of Europe for the longest time. As a result of this immigration and high birth rates by ethnic minorities, countries like France and the UK are more ethnically diverse than the US was in the 1950s. And several European countries are already more religiously diverse than the US due to the growth of Islam. In fact, based on current projections with immigration and the birth rates of minorities, Europe is only going to become more diverse. If we look at the birth statistics for European countries, France and the UK have between 25 to 30% of births from non-European descended women. As a result, France, for example, could see its Muslim population jump to 25% by 2050, up from 13% today. But many of these ethnic minorities are poorly integrated, which is why we have to understand how integration works, and for that we have the Berry model, developed in 1992 by American psychologist John Berry. It describes how minorities define themselves on 2 dimensions: how they relate to their ethnic or religious identity, and how they relate to the country where they live. There are 4 possible strategies: assimilation, integration, separation, and marginalization. Generally speaking, having people detached from society or in these bottom 2 categories isn't a good thing. That's why the goal of integration policies are to move people from the bottom categories to one of the top ones. And according to the work of Lars Leschinski, a German sociologist, the most important thing for minorities to integrate with national country are language skills, cultural similarity, citizenship, religiousness, native majority contact, and perceived discrimination. These dimensions are linked to one another. If you have no native contact, then you won't learn the language, and if you don't learn the language, then you often won't get citizenship. Well, a lot of that has to do with immigrant selection, in other words, who Europe let in. Most of Europe's immigrants have been and still are low-skilled as workers and refugees. Today, about 40% of immigrants to Europe have only basic education. Many low-skilled immigrants are simply unemployable in European countries. Repeated efforts by the Danish government to encourage employment of its ethnic minorities have failed because they can only fill public useful jobs like landscaping at great cost to the Danish government. This means they're less likely to have jobs, meet natives, and adapt culturally. And the low selectivity and distant cultures from which these migrants come from have led to some pretty big cultural differences, which can lead to rejection. In the book Why Muslim Integration Fails in Christian Heritage Societies, the authors make the distinction between rational and non-rational discrimination. Basically, non-rational discrimination is linked to stereotypes associated with physical characteristics, like skin color, foreign-sounding names, or religious signs. Meanwhile, rational discrimination is linked to communication issues, as well as certain attitudes like work ethic or behavior. In fact, some cultural traits simply make for worse employees. In one study, Muslim call center employees were 10 to 15% less productive during Ramadan and took fewer calls. Another study found that Muslims in France, many of whom are the descendants of low-skilled workers from North Africa, are engaged in quiet quitting, the act of doing the bare minimum at their jobs at much higher rates than other employees in France. In practice, it's actually hard to separate rational from non-rational discrimination, especially because Europe's minorities are visibly different. Are they being discriminated because of their skin color or religious signs, or because of the attitudes that are associated with their group? Well, according to the Handbook of Stereotypes, Prejudice and Discrimination, it's both. It suggests that the extent to which people's stereotypes corresponded with reality was strikingly high. Because of the fact that they have cultural differences that make them less productive and generate social friction, and the fact that they're visibly different, the discrimination of visible minorities is on the rise, with fewer responses to job applications or more police controls. If we combine the skill level of immigration with their visibility, we would get a framework that looks something like this, with two dimensions: visible, invisible, skilled, low-skilled, with long-term problems for visible, low-skilled minorities, which is why most countries do not let visibly distinct, low-skilled minorities from distant cultures stay in the country for long-term. The combination of rational reasons for discrimination, traits, and visible signs leads to a discrimination equilibrium, where one marginalized group rejects and is rejected by society. That's likely why psychological studies into immigrant well-being show that European-descended immigrants do better when assimilated, whereas non-Europeans do better when integrated. And those cultural differences and the friction they create can also lead to segregation. Many of Europe's immigrants are Muslims who are more religious and self-segregate for religious purposes, something that I covered in a previous video. Meanwhile, Europe's natives have also contributed to segregation. While most immigrants moved to working-class neighborhoods, over time they became ethnic ghettos as natives moved away, to avoid social friction and crime. In an attempt to deal with these integration challenges, many European countries turned to multicultural policies in the 1980s. According to the Queen's University Multicultural Policy Index, which measures the evolution of these policies, Sweden and Finland became the most multicultural in Europe, while Denmark and France remained mostly assimilationist, and the Netherlands received its policies in the 2010s. While these policies did help by granting citizenship and reducing perceived discrimination, on other aspects they were actually counterproductive. Promoting ethnic language or funding minority organizations doesn't increase contact with natives, improve language skills, or push minorities to adapt culturally, which would reduce discrimination in the long run. For Europe's Muslims, the result of these policies has been even worse. With self-segregation, they have not only kept cultural gaps, but widened them compared to other immigrants. At the same time, European countries downplayed or deconstructed their own national identities out of a fear that nationalism would once again tear the continent apart, meaning that there was hardly an identity to integrate to. Generous European welfare states, which were opened up to non-citizens and immigrants in the 90s and 2000s, discouraged ethnic minorities to look for jobs and participate in wider society, or adapt culturally. And it's fair to say there has also been widespread abuse of Europe's welfare systems by immigrants, some of whom were attracted by the so-called welfare magnet. While this should be pretty obvious, here is a Danish study showing that reducing social benefits significantly reduced non-Western immigration to the country. Independently of the cost for European taxpayers, which I talked about in this video on the economics of immigration, having a bunch of unemployed people is not good for integration. And new technologies and faster travel has allowed immigrants to keep closer ties with their home countries and cultures, meaning they are effectively able to keep living in the same cultural bubble. Those technologies have also been used by foreign governments to keep ties with their diasporas, sometimes encouraging them not to integrate. As you can tell by this overview, European immigration and integration policy is not exactly set up for success. And the cost of failed integration is heavy for society. As a result of multicultural policies and segregation, European countries stopped having or promoting a common identity, This has led to a breakdown in communication, decreased worker satisfaction, and led to falling levels of social trust in diverse areas of Denmark and Germany. The lack of a common culture and identity has made running schools or companies harder. Denmark, despite its stellar educational system, has one of the largest gaps when it comes to teaching students from an immigrant background. The PISA test scores between second and first generation immigrants have increased by just 9 points. In other words, its one-size-fits-all education system doesn't work with non-Danes. European police forces and courts have also struggled to keep up with increased crime by unintegrated ethnic minorities. Low-skilled immigrants, particularly from Africa and the Middle East, are heavily overrepresented in crime statistics across Europe, with numbers especially high for violent crimes, including sexual violence and rape. While sociologists point that this is partly because many immigrants are poorer and come from broken homes, this isn't the only explanation. This 2020 study found that while there was about 20% point difference in convictions between native Dutch and Moroccan Dutch, about 12% was left unexplained, suggesting a cultural explanation. And in a chilling article dated to 2017, one Afghan translator in Austria theorized that rapes committed by Afghans were committed not because of cultural misunderstandings, but because they are motivated by a deep and abiding contempt for Western civilization. To them, Europeans are the enemy and their women are legitimate spoils, as are all the other things one can take from them: housing, money, passports. Their laws don't matter, their culture is uninteresting, and ultimately their civilization is going to fall anyway to the horde of which one is the spearhead. No need to assimilate or work hard or try to build a decent life here for yourself. These Europeans are too soft to seriously punish you for your transgression, and their days are numbered. Even if we leave that aside for a second, if they continue to make up a low-skilled separate group, it'll be hard to improve their economic situation, which increases crime. And high crime is also a problem in the long run. When we look at crime data for immigrants and their descendants in Denmark, immigrant descendants commit more crimes than their parents. This has been made worse by governments ignoring this story for decades. In fact, one Swedish researcher was sued by the government for disclosing the nationality of immigrants committing the rapes. And because of the growing size of Europe's ethnic minorities, it becomes even more challenging to solve some of these problems. Requesting cultural adaptation or tackling crime are seen as politically targeted and outright discriminatory moves. This has also antagonized Europe's majority population. The UK is probably the worst country at this. Attempts to eliminate inequality between different groups and perceived discrimination have led to some pretty discriminatory policies against whites. Hate speech laws target critics of immigration, ethnic minority crime, or cultural change. And through affirmative action policies, it discriminates against whites in the workplace and was said to have special treatment for ethnic minorities in its courts. This has been made worse by anti-white racism, which is prevalent among some ethnic minorities in Europe, in the form of racial slurs or targeted crime. Since this is still a relatively taboo topic, I can only provide anecdotal evidence. But in France, with high levels of non-European immigration, anti-white violence has become pretty common, while courts often ignore the racial aspect of attacks. In fact, the right-wing Les Républicains even called it ethnic cleansing of certain neighborhoods, as inhabitants are pushed out by violence and incivility. Meanwhile, in the UK, the targeting of mostly white girls by mostly Pakistani grooming gangs suggests this is not an isolated phenomenon. And while the EU has unveiled a plan to tackle discrimination, that plan excludes discrimination of white or Christians, which, as we've seen, exists in Europe. As a result, European politics has become more fragmented. In the streets, this has meant rioting by ethnic minorities who feel discriminated, and more recently by ethnic majorities in Ireland and the UK, who are now feeling like they're being treated as second-class citizens in their own countries. Most groups in European countries are small and don't have much influence beyond the local level. But a cohesive uniting force can turn them into significant voting blocs or even political parties, something I explored in depth with Europe's Muslim communities. And multiculturalism has made it harder for European countries to defend themselves militarily. Ethnic minorities are less likely to relate to their country, which has led to espionage, subversion, or radicalization. And it's a problem for militaries as well. Back in the 1990s, North African conscripts in France were far more likely to desert or disobey orders, in part because they felt discriminated and suffered from an identity crisis. In fact, more British Muslims went to serve for ISIS than there were in the entire British military, and there are so few motivated ethnic minority recruits that the British Army recruits minorities abroad to fill its racial diversity quotas. While European governments have rightly focused on promoting tolerance among white Europeans and on cracking down on xenophobia to reduce perceived discrimination, they've not taken action or succeeded in tackling the crime, incivility, or cultural gaps of ethnic minorities, which often are the causes of discrimination. Just to illustrate, in 2006, the EU banned the term Islamic terrorism from its lexicon to avoid antagonizing Muslims. But several European countries still tolerate hate preachers in the name of religious rights. In other words, European governments have treated one of the symptoms of multicultural problems, namely discrimination, while ignoring the root causes. This terrible track record had prompted several European leaders like Angela Merkel or former British Prime Minister David Cameron to declare that multiculturalism had failed in the early 2010s. Ironically though, this did not stop them or their successors from pursuing pro-immigration policies, in part due to pressures from the labor market and with the idea that mass low-skilled immigration could eventually be incorporated into the labor force. With all these problems, it's safe to say that Europe has a bumpy road ahead when it comes to managing diversity and multiculturalism. So what can Europe do about its unintegrated minorities? Well, according to the Berry model, there are 4 ways societies can deal with minorities: multiculturalism, assimilation, segregation, and exclusion. In reality, there are really only 2, because if a society actively excludes a group, it doesn't stay multicultural for very long. And if a society is segregated, then you can hardly call it a single society. So, a successful society is one where minorities are either integrated or assimilated, and it's cohesive, resilient, and inclusive economically. And so to succeed, there are a couple of paths forward. We can map the strategies that European countries can implement on this new framework that I created, inspired by the Berry model. It basically has 2 different dimensions. The first is whether a country preserves the ethnic identities of its minorities or actively tries to assimilate a minority. Whereas the second dimension is the method used to reach that goal, which can be either illiberal or illiberal. For example, China, with its draconian assimilation policies in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, is an illiberal assimilationist, while Singapore is an illiberal multiculturalist, managing diversity with strict laws. Meanwhile, Denmark has been a liberal assimilationist, promoting Danish values, but has recently adopted stricter policies, moving a bit in the illiberal direction. The United Arab Emirates could also be interesting to study, since 88% of its population is foreign-born, and it's a pretty successful country. But its ethnic minorities aren't citizens, which means it just deports people it doesn't like. It would, however, count as an illiberal multiculturalist, similar to Singapore. Most European countries have been liberal multiculturalists, but liberal multiculturalism, especially with the levels of immigration Europe has seen, hasn't worked, especially with Muslims. Even the countries that focus on assimilation, like France, struggle due to high levels of low-skilled Muslim immigration and high levels of segregation. But lucky for us, Denmark and Singapore have cookbooks that could help European countries navigate the multicultural challenge and the pain points of diversity. Let's first look at Denmark. The country first became multicultural in the 1960s when it welcomed guest workers, but it developed even further when it adopted one of the world's most liberal asylum laws, and many more immigrants and refugees arrived from the Middle East. However, it took a different direction than the rest of Europe when it noticed that integration was failing. In subsequent years, it started restricting family reunification and refugees from coming to the country, and raised the requirements for receiving citizenship. While Denmark has never had more non-Western immigration than today, only about 5,000 people become Danish every year, after a long process where immigrants have to prove their attachment to the country. This means that it can more easily deport non-citizens who fail up to live to its rules and values. For the ethnic minorities with citizenship already in the country, Denmark plans to assimilate them to Danish identity over time. With its series of ghetto laws, it has geared its education system to promote tolerance, but crucially civility and Danish values as well, to minorities, starting education as young as 1 for some minority children. Denmark has also moved to crack down on crime, doubling prison sentences in high-crime ghetto areas, and spread its ethnic minorities across the country by breaking apart ethnic ghettos. When it comes to managing relations between groups, it has imposed some limits on free speech. It has banned hate preachers, for example, and radical foreign-funded mosques, but also has a ban on Quran burnings to avoid antagonizing its Muslim minority. Meanwhile, Singapore's approach is pretty different because the country was multicultural from the beginning. Chinese majority Singapore left the Malaysian Federation in the 1960s after it became clear that Malaysia would be a Malay-first country. After a series of race riots in the 1960s, the country's founder, Lee Kuan Yew, vowed to create a multicultural state with an inclusive Singaporean identity. It decided not to be a Chinese-first society, partially because of inclusion, but also because it would anger its much larger neighbors. Singapore created a pillarized society where its 3 communities have their own rules, schooling institutions, and even laws, but a common civic identity to unite them. Trust is created by co-living, with buildings and neighborhoods having ethnic quotas to increase interaction between groups. While harmony is guaranteed by a strict police force, which cracks down on crime hard, even with physical punishment. as well as police's antisocial behavior and community tensions through racial and religious harmony laws. Basically, if no one can litter or commit crimes without being punished, then prejudice has no room to grow. And while it does spend more money helping underperforming Malays to improve their academic scores, it doesn't give special treatment for entrance to jobs or universities. But to guarantee stability, it has to keep the country's ethnic makeup consistent with immigration quotas to make sure no group feels that they will lose their status. In fact, it limits naturalization almost entirely to Indian, Chinese, and Malays, many of which come from neighboring Malaysia. And the Singaporean model has been pretty successful, with 80 to 90% of Singaporeans now feeling integrated or assimilated into this common identity. So, if we summarize the Singaporean and Danish model, both countries have created and enforce a common identity. They actively promote that identity through their education systems while promoting tolerance and civility in schools, which reduces perceived discrimination. Both countries limit free speech by regulating Islam and kicking out hate preachers, but also by preventing religious and racial antagonization, which reduces religiousness and perceived discrimination. Meanwhile, their police force and courts are designed to crack down on crime, particularly by ethnic minorities in the case of Denmark, to reduce the negative image and discrimination. Though Singapore, being an illiberal state, takes many of the punishments and speech restrictions further than Denmark. Both encourage social mixing with housing policies and maintain a balance of power by being restrictive on immigration and naturalizations. While integration isn't perfect and Malays still face some discrimination in Singapore, this has allowed the country to break out of the discrimination equilibrium that existed previously between races, such that interracial marriages are on the rise. Though we'll have to wait and see a generation longer to see what happens in Denmark. So now that we have two working models to play with, can European countries make this work? Well, if Europe wants to succeed, there is a long road ahead and three pretty big challenges. First, European countries face a demographic challenge. Cutting back immigration is at odds with the demographic and economic reality of its aging population, though it could make it more restrictive. Second, Europe needs a consensus to adopt one of these solutions. In Denmark and Singapore, everyone got on board, either across the political spectrum or in each ethnic group. That's something that's harder to do considering the growing demographic weight of ethnic minorities in Europe. Major concern is Europe's growing and increasingly radical Muslim population. As I previously discussed in another video, young Muslims in Europe want Sharia law and are ready to use violence for it. If one group views it as their duty to submit and convert the rest of society and is unwilling to compromise, it's a big issue for a multicultural society. And finally, we need political will. Western European governments have long ignored the challenges posed by multiculturalism. While Denmark has avoided this trend, and Sweden seems to have a late wake-up call following gang wars and skyrocketing crime, in most Western European countries, the only political parties proposing to do anything close to what I've discussed in this video are labeled as far-right. Some countries have half-baked solutions that are bound to make their multicultural problems worse. For example, Ireland's left-wing governments, bad migration policy aside, have an even worse integration policy. It distributes migrants across the country but does not tackle the crime it has brought, which has led to a massive increase in crime in rural areas and is triggering public backlash. And if European governments don't actively manage multiculturalism, Europe faces three major risks. First, the loss of European culture. Europeans could lose their culture as a result of demographic change, or alternatively because they keep lowering the bar for integration. In fact, we're already seeing some of that happen. In some European cities, native Europeans are adopting values from ethnic minorities. In other words, we're seeing reverse assimilation. Things like food preferences or changing language patterns might not be a big deal, but others like attitudes towards blasphemy, gender relations, female genital mutilation, homosexuality, or free speech are much more worrying. Demographic changes are already leading to rising homophobia. In some cases, there's even forceful assimilation to Islam, with cancellation of concerts, non-Islamic festivals out of fear of Islamic terrorism. Second, European countries could end up as failed multicultural societies, or in other words, in the bottom half of the Berry model. The spectrum of options for this range from a United States situation to a Lebanon scenario. In the American scenario, ethnic minority violence has led to a return of segregation after the civil rights movements. Whites left cities for the suburbs to avoid black crime, and it has led to a growth of gated communities across the country. Second is a Lebanon scenario, where the balance of power between the different religious communities in the country shifted as a result of immigration in the 1950s. This led to a civil war in the 90s and to an armed stalemate between the three different religious communities of the country. Parts of Europe are already well on their way to an American scenario, with many European cities now considered unsafe. As a result, we're witnessing white flight, where white people moved out of areas with rising crime. In fact, more Europeans are choosing to live in gated communities, often due to safety concerns. And I would argue that France is already on its way to a Lebanon scenario with growing segregation, ethnic violence, and an ethnic minority political bloc in the form of La France Insoumise. If the situation gets worse, segregation might no longer be enough to avoid multicultural problems, and certain policies like the mass deportation, including of ethnic minority citizens, could take hold. This could lead to radical governments or citizens taking matters into their own hand. And we're already seeing evidence of this in Ireland, with the citizens pushing back against immigration through what can only be described as terror attacks. This is laying the groundwork for a potential racial or religious civil war in Europe, something that many politicians and intellectuals in both the UK and France are starting to fear. But do you think European governments can do damage control before things get out of hand? Will they go for the Denmark route or the Singaporean approach? Or will they keep muddling through their multicultural problems? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Additionally, I wanted to make a couple of announcements and updates in this video. The first is why I haven't posted so much these past couple of months. I developed a series of food intolerances which had a pretty big physical and mental impact, and I had to take some time to rewire my entire diet and how I cook food. And as a result, I had to cut back significantly on my working hours. While I'm not out of the woods yet, now that I cut out a lot of foods, I feel much more energetic, and I'm happy to be back at work. This allowed me to start a long-term project of mine, my second channel called Last Week in Europe, where I focus on more weekly updates. Recently, I covered the impact of Denmark's social engineering policies, which looks at the economic impact of its integration policies. If that sounds like something for you, then go check it out here. Finally, if you like this video and would like more of this type of content, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Deep dive are time-consuming and expensive to make, and it's simply harder to get sponsors for topics like this one. This means it's only possible if I have more direct support in the form of Patreon. And in the process of making this video, I did a lot of research reading into the history of European diversity, particularly religious diversity, which didn't make it into the final version of this video. It did, however, make it into a Patreon-exclusive mini-series on the history of European multiculturalism, where I looked into policies implemented by France, England, the Netherlands, and Spain to deal with their religious minorities with regards to Catholics, Protestants, but also Muslims. So if you want to support the channel and get access to some bonus content, then go check it out here. Anyways, I'll see you in the next video, whether it be on Patreon, Last Week in Europe, or on this channel right here. It's good to be back.